taking the time to view this short circuit on how to create a Tier 2 historian or a replication server in Wonderware Historian 10. A Tier 2 historian is simply another Wonderware Historian version 10 system. It must be of the same version and patch level as the Tier 1 historian, but does not necessarily have to be of the same tag count. But it must have enough license tags for the data being replicated. So for example, a 5,000 tag Tier 1 historian could not replicate 1,000 of its tags to a 500 tag Tier 2 historian. However, a 5,000 tag Tier 1 historian could replicate 1,000 tags to a 5,000 tag Tier 2 historian without any problem at all. A Tier 2 historian is located anywhere on a network that is common to the Tier 1 historian. The good news is that if it is accessible from a Tier 1 historian and should go offline, the Tier 1 historian will store forward the data that was being replicated until the Tier 2 system comes back online, or of course until the Tier 1 historian runs out of storage space. The storage space that is available is defined when creating the Tier 2 historian. The Tier 2 historian must have sufficient storage space for the replications that are being sent up to it, which is to say you have to make sure that you're not going to run out of disk space when you start replicating data to your Tier 2 historian. It's important to note that both servers have to be of the same type, which is to say that a case-sensitive SQL server can replicate data to another case-sensitive SQL server, or a case-insensitive SQL server can replicate data to another case-insensitive SQL server. However, a case-sensitive SQL server cannot replicate data to a case-insensitive SQL server. The purpose of a Tier 2 historian is simple. The basic use is to replicate some or all data from a Tier 1 historian. It can be used as an amalgamation point for multiple remote historians, say in the example of a water facility that has 5 remote stations, each collecting their own data, and that data is being amalgamated up to a central station for reporting purposes. It's quite often used as an aggregation server or a reporting server in order to reduce the load on a Tier 1 server. So if a Tier 1 server was very busy collecting tens of thousands of data points, it would be wise to have those data points being replicated back to a Tier 2 server, and that way all of the reporting requirements and the loading that they would be created can be done on the Tier 2 server. It can also serve as a backup server for stored data, but it is important to note it is not a failover or redundancy server for live data. A failover redundancy server is a completely different type of server and has nothing to do with being a Tier 2 server. A typical architecture of a Tier 2 historian looks like this. You have a Tier 1 historian that is collecting data from either perhaps application server or InTouch, and that data is then being pushed or replicated back on a Tier 2 server, which could be used for, in this example, centralized reporting or a system of record. Another example could be that you would have multiple Tier 2 historians, perhaps as in this example, one in New York for reporting or report generation purposes in the US, and one in London for report generation purposes for Europe. Another example would be to use a Tier 2 historian to summarize data so that none of the data is actually being summarized in the Tier 1 server. It is just all being replicated up to the Tier 2 server, and then all of the aggregation is taking place at that time. And the last, of course, example would be a total data replication where all of the data from the Tier 1 server at 1-second intervals is being replicated back up to a Tier 2 server. Setting up a Tier 2 or replication server is quite an easy thing to do actually. All work is done in the System Management Console, or the SMC. The first step is, of course, to define the replication server, and this can be done either by name or by IP address. Today we'll use the IP address to do so. The next thing will be, of course, to test the connection to make sure that the Tier 1 historian can talk to the Tier 2 historian. Assuming the connection is successful, the next thing will be to define the replication naming convention for replicated tags. This is to say that we do not want the tags on the Tier 2 historian to have the exact same name as the tags on the Tier 1 historian, as this could get quite confusing when defining reports. The next thing to do will be to choose the tags that are to be replicated on Tier 2 from the Tier 1 data tags. Then all we need to do is commit the changes to the historian, and after that we just test the data for the accuracy to make sure that the data that's being replicated is as accurate as it has to be. In order to demonstrate replication of data and creating a Tier 2 server, we'll use a very simple tank application. This tank fills and drains, and when it gets to its maximum level we turn on a pump and we consume power in order to drain the tank. To create the Tier 2 server, it's really simple. All we do is we go to the Tier 1 server, in which case we find that's called robwin2k8vm, and then all we have to do is open up the configuration editor, and then we'll go down to Replication, and we'll note that we have no extra replication servers available at this point. To create one, we click on Replication Servers and we say we'd like a new replication server. We can create the server either by node name or IP address. In this case we have a server available to us by 20.20.20.151, so we'll use the IP address. As we type it, it'll create the store forward path that'll be used in the event that the Tier 2 server goes offline. It's also given us a default of 125 megs of storage space, but if we had a lot of tags being replicated, we might need far more than that. Next, all we need to do is log on to the Tier 2 server using an appropriate username and password. And if we give it the right information, we should be able to test the connection and see that it's correct. And so it is. So the next thing to do is to move ahead, but since I've used this name before, it's going to ask me, is it alright if we use the same store forward path? I'll say yes. The next thing to do is to define the prefix for all the tag names being stored on the Tier 2 server, as we don't want them to be exactly the same. In this case, I'll use a very simple naming convention, which is just the short form of the server name, so RW2K8VM. Now I have to also say what other information do I want to append, and since I want to append the tag name, and I want to append the group, etc., so I'll just insert all of those. The abbreviation, and in our case we're only going to do a very simple tag replication, so for the simple replication I'll give it the same R2W2K8VM, and I'll just add in that all I want is the tag name. I'm not really interested in the abbreviation or the group. After I've done this, I'll note that it's already defined a TCP port to talk over, a minimum store forward duration, and a buffer count, and I'll accept all of those. So once that's done, the next thing to do will be to open up the new Tier 2 replication server that we've created and define some tags that we're going to replicate to it. We do that by choosing Simple Replication, Add Multiple Tags. It's important to note that all of the tags that are being replicated are actually coming from the Tier 1 server, which is robwin2k8vm. So I'll type in that I want to see tank, see how many tank tags I can find. And there are my tank levels, so I'll put all 4 tank levels over to be replicated. And the other thing I'm interested in is the power level. So what I'll do is I'll type in power and see if I can find my power tags. And I have been able to do so. So what I'll do is I'll add those 4 tags over. And now I have all the tags that I've chosen to replicate from my Tier 1 server on my Tier 2. The next thing is I get a chance to look at what I've done. So I can see that the source tag is tank level _001, and all of the tags that I replicate will have the prefix that I asked for in front of them. The next thing it will do is check to make sure this is good. I can do this, and I'll close. Well, now note, right, that those tags, the source tag name, the destination tag, all appear under this simple replication tab on the Tier 1. At this point, the only thing left to do is to commit the pending changes to the server. If I choose, I can display what changes are going to be committed, and I'll see that it's all the tags I've chosen to make Tier 2 replicated. If I commit them and everything goes well, I'll see that that has happened, and I'm done. After we have defined the Tier 2 server, the final thing to do is to check to make sure that the tags actually did get replicated to the Tier 2 server and the data is actually accurate against the Tier 1 server. If we see here we have the Tier 1 server, and we can look down below and see some of the tags that we are interested in. And if we check on the Tier 2 server, we can see that, there they are, the tags that we asked to be replicated, power level, tank level, etc., with the RW2KVM prefix have been replicated. So let's create a new trend, and what we'll do is we'll put some of these tags on there and we'll verify that the data is exactly the same. So we'll put the power from Tier 1 on the trend, and we'll put the tank level from Tier 1 on the trend, and then we'll scale all the tags just to make sure that we can see everything. Then the next thing we want to do is go over to the Tier 2 server, and we want to put exactly the same tags on the trend. So we'll put the power from Tier 2 on the trend and the tank level from Tier 2 on the trend, and then scale the tags again to make sure that all of the scales are equal. And the funny thing is that it appears we only have two trend lines, and the reason for that is that the trends are actually superimposed over each other. Now we can actually verify that by turning off some of the tags. So for example, whatever tag we choose to turn off, we should see no change. So this time we'll turn off the Tier 2 tag, and other than a color change to represent the tank level, there's no change. And if we turn it back on, it appears to be just the same trend in a different color. If we then go to the Tier 1 server and do the same thing, we'll have exactly the same effect. So this can show us that the data is indeed being completely replicated exactly as it's coming into the server. If we do the same with power, we'll get exactly the same effect. Now a final way to check all of this would be to look at the actual data itself, and we can do that quite simply. All we have to do is say that we want to see the data that makes up the chart. So we'll look at the data log in a wide format, and if we size the columns so that we can see everything and take it to where there's data for all the tags, we can see right across the board that the data is exactly the same. So whether or not we're looking at tank level or we're looking at power level, we can see that the tags have been completely replicated exactly as they were received. So 980 equals 980 or 70 and so on. Thank you very much for taking the time to view the short circuit. We hope that you found it helpful and it gives you some idea on how you could put to use a replicating server. We'd like to remind all viewers that the short circuits provided are not intended to replace product training, and that if you are working and developing projects using our software, we highly recommend that you be fully trained so that you can take full advantage of all of the features that are included. Thank you again.